My friend and favorite columnist Jen Rubin is here to discuss the legacy media, pardons, and how we oppose Donald Trump going into 2025. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Thank you, Jen Rubin, for joining us on Defending Democracy.
It is a pleasure to be here, Marc.
So I want to jump right in to one of your most recent columns because, I always find myself reading your columns and then I'm like, yes, I agree with all of that. But this one, I really, really agree with all of it. And you talk about how courage is in short supply among Democrats and the media. And I, first of all, agree with you on everything. But I want to sort of give you a chance to sort of unpack not just that it is in short supply, but the why.
Yes.
Why is it in short supply?
Yes. Let me begin by saying that, of course, the worst shortage is on the Republican side, which allowed Donald Trump to come to power, fostered him, has apologized for him, has normalized him. And simply by pointing out the Democrats and the media's errors should in no way deter from the central responsibility that Republicans have for the damage they are doing to democracy. That said, I think what is happening is a very disagreeable but familiar pattern that you see in democracies that are backsliding, and that is what Timothy Snyder calls obeying in advance. In other words, capitulating, trying to ingratiate oneself with the new power structure to try to improve one's condition or at least shelter one from harm. Now, it's most apparent in the media, where you literally have media owners going to Donald Trump to give him $1 million. I cannot imagine that this could ever have come to be in any other time, in any other place. Can you imagine Katharine Graham giving Richard Nixon $1 million? I can't. It's beyond belief. And frankly, ABC's decision to settle a defamation case for $15 million is only a different form of the same paying of tribute, if you will, to Donald Trump. Those media outlets are desperate to recover an audience they have lost. They are misguided in thinking the way to do that is to lure MAGA Republicans to watch them and to view them. They will never watch or view them, and they are simply succeeding, if you can call it that, in chasing off their existing viewership and readership. It is a terrible case of not understanding who your customer is. And because many media outlets are now owned by individuals or companies with other interests, there is an inherent, now blatant conflict of interest as they try to further their own corporate interests in much bigger organizations than a newspaper or a network, and frankly, sacrifice journalistic independence and principles along the way. Now, the Democrats are a different story, and I don't mean to suggest all Democrats are doing that. We've seen phenomenal examples of people really holding the line and taking not only the Republicans to town and to the woodshed, but their own Democrats. And I point to people like Chris Murphy, Elizabeth Warren. There are far too many Democrats, however, using a phrase that I have come to loathe, and that is striving for common ground. What does that mean? Donald Trump wants to deport 11 million or so people. What is the common ground? Deporting just 5.5 million people? You cannot have common ground with someone whose starting position is authoritarianism, is cruelty, is destruction of a functional democratic government. So the notion that they are advancing is not only preposterous and makes them look silly and weak, but it has the effect of normalizing Trump. It's saying, well, we want common ground, so he must want common ground. We'll find that common ground. That's just absurd. You don't appoint or nominate Kash Patel when you're looking for common ground. You don't decide to blow up a bill to keep the government operating if you want common ground. So it is frankly self-defeating, somewhat ludicrous for them to say that. Listen, I get it. I get there are times where, for example, you have to swallow a disagreeable item or amendment or poison pill, whatever you want to call it, in order to get something done. But that is not saying, oh, we have reached common ground. That is not saying, oh, I agree too that we should cut out medical care for trans kids who are whose parents are in the military. That's saying I might have to grit my teeth and do something I despise, and here's what I despise, in order to do something else. Hard compromises are what politics are all about. And I respect Democrats on both sides of those issues, those who voted for and those who voted against. What I'm talking about is something different, and that is glossifying, prettifying what Trump is doing as normal politics, in which Democrats have some responsibility to meet him halfway. It seems like just yesterday that Joe Biden was president, and what did the media say? Why isn't he unifying the country? Ideal that it was the president's responsibility. The standard here is so screwed up. And frankly, the Democrats who talk this common ground language help screw it up by forgetting that the president is the one who is elected by all the people, or at least a plurality of the electoral college, majority of the electoral college. It is his responsibility to be president for everyone. It's his responsibility to find areas of agreement. So I kind of think that part of what this talk is about is just the kind of gibberish that politicians say because some consultant told them that it polls well to say X phrase. And they don't even think about what they're saying. So I don't want to attribute malice, but I do want to attribute silliness and irresponsibility. And I hope by calling attention to it, there'll be less of it. And there'll be more inclination to explain to the American people exactly what Trump is doing, why he's doing it, and why this is not politics as normal, why this is outside the realm of acceptable democratic small d behavior. So that, in a nutshell, was what my piece was about. And so far, the response has been rather positive, I must say, because I think I am channeling a certain level of frustration that many Democrats are expressing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And before the election, I used to say all the time that I don't see common ground with Republicans on voting rights because there's no middle ground between an arsonist and a firefighter. And
Exactly.
the point that I think you're making, which I agree with, is like, sure, are there times where you find compromise? If you want to fund a program at $1 billion and the other side wants to fund it at $1.6 billion, and you say, okay, well, let's find a place in the middle. But fundamentally, you have one party here who doesn't want government to work at all and wants to aggrandize Donald Trump to be a near dictator. And so, like, what's the midpoint between
Right.
that?
Right, exactly. And it is this almost pathetic desperation to pretend everything is normal. It's like the cartoon character who walks across, over the cliff and doesn't look down thinking, okay, we're going to keep on going the way we've been going. But maybe this latest episode, we're recording this on Friday when Trump and President Musk, who is apparently running the thing, has blown up the deal. Maybe this will be a reminder that the people we are dealing with are not interested in improving the lives of Americans. They're not interested in good governance. They're not interested in any kind of governance. They're interested in robbing the Treasury and the taxpayer blind and doing a lot of things that, frankly, empower them to look and talk and act like Viktor Orban and like other authoritarian leaders around the world. That's who these people are. And we better wake up, we better call it out, and we better come up with some red lines that we will not cross, no matter what, if we're going to survive this period.
Yeah, and I want to double back to your first point about the media, because I think that we all were proved wrong on a fundamental assumption. I think the fundamental assumption that we had was that where you had large corporate or billionaire ownership of major newspapers, that meant that those newspapers or media outlets more generally would have a freer hand because the owners wouldn't have to worry about whether they were making money on this edition or that, or whether this story alienated people or not. What I think we didn't realize is that actually they are more brittle
Yes.
because of their outside business interests, because in fact they don't have that much skin in the game for the outlet. Their skin in the game is for these other business interests they have, which can be very sensitively impacted by politicians, by someone like a Donald Trump. And therefore, they're actually kind of like not willing to sacrifice all that much. And it's
Exactly.
not just, you could look at Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, you could look at obviously what's going on in the LA Times. But, I was struck by something that Oliver Darcy, who is a media critic and columnist, he has a great newsletter. If people don't subscribe to, I recommend it. And he said that even MSNBC's new owner,
Yes.
the new leadership,
Of
because it's being spun off from a
Spinco,
company,
which is
what
like a great name, Spinco, right?
was
For a
saying
book.
we need to be more acceptable to Republicans.
Yeah, yeah,
And I'm thinking, well, that can't be based on like your viewership, right? That's not like a winner in the
right.
ratings.
Yes, yes. And, I think there's like a game. They want to get to absolute zero in their viewership. When Joe and Mika tripped off to Mar-a-Lago, they were shocked that their viewers revolted and about half of them left because they apparently thought that whatever they do is going to be fine with their audience. And in fact, the viewers, the news consumers are more idealistic, more driven by principle than they are. And they watch them not because they want to have, them told that all their views are correct, but because they're starved for some insight, for some good arguments, for material in which to go into battle intellectually otherwise with Republicans. And if you're just going to join them, well, then go turn on Fox.
Right.
They have much more coverage of Mar-a-Lago. If you want to know like how to butter up Donald Trump, I'm not going to ask Mika and Joe. They're amateurs. They're pikers at this. So they have confused, I think, entirely who their audience is, what their purpose is. And I think this becomes this kind of death spiral of the media. I see it so much more clearly in the LA Times because I grew up in LA. And I
Oh,
remember the LA Times when it was a great newspaper in the 60s and 70s. It was thick, it was meaty, it had the best critics, it had the best analysis, it had the best cartoonists, political cartoonists in the business, Paul Conrad.
oh yeah.
It was fabulous. And slowly, as they lost readership, they started cutting back. The paper got literally thinner and thinner and thinner. And finally, it was not sustainable. And they sold out to a billionaire who now puts a media meter, a bias meter on stories in the opinion section. By the way, first lesson of owning a newspaper, opinion writers have a bias. They have a perspective. That's what they're paid for. No one thinks that I am without bias. So once they do this death spin, they wind up chasing more of their diminishing audience. They're just chasing them away faster and faster and faster. Whoever didn't abandon ship when they were outraged that the LA Times didn't endorse Kamala Harris has now thrown up their hands and said, well, I'm not going to pay for this shit anymore. My God, I was willing to give them a chance, but this? And that kind of reinforcement, whether it's MSNBC, whether it's the Los Angeles Times, whether it's ABC, it just keeps going and going. And it's like they have no idea how to change the pattern of a losing proposition. And in my book, what I would do if I owned the world, if I owned a outlet like this, is I would double down on truth telling.
Right.
That's what newspapers are for. I would hire a million investigative reporters. I would hire the smartest, toughest, most aggressive opinion writers. I would make news and provide news because that's who people who buy newspapers these days, who watch MSNBC, who watch CNN, want. It's not only the mission of journalism, after all. Remember that? Oh, yeah, they're supposed to be the watchdogs. They're supposed to be independent. They're supposed to hold power accountable. It's not only their ethical, professional mission, but it's the only business model that could possibly work because no one's going to outfox Fox. If you want that, go turn on Fox.
Yeah, I think that the one that sort of in some ways kicked this off that I still find the most curious was CNN. CNN actually had a profoundly powerful brand. It was the place when, you might dabble in Fox, or you might dabble in MSNBC, but it was, kind of like the Washington Post and the New York Times. It was like the place when like something's really happening, like that's where you were gonna tune in. And how they misread the audience that they had, that somehow they thought that the way they were going to grow was going to essentially jettison a commitment to democracy in the hope of putting Scott Jennings on air so that he can fundamentally mock your network every day.
Right. Yes.
It's just like, I don't get it. I don't
Yeah.
see how all these people are smart and they're media executives. They have all this data. How do they not see that?
Well, part of it is that I think they misread the decline in media viewership and readership for something else. Media readership and viewership declined because the media is fragmented. People who used to only watch CNN can now listen to podcasts. They can listen to you. They can listen to other podcasts. They can read websites. So there was a natural leveling off and decline in these big media, frankly, monopolies, because the audience had many more choices. Instead of understanding that and addressing that, they said, oh, the problem must be we're too newspapery for people. We have to be dumber. We have to be non-newsy. We have to have people who have views that our current readers don't share because there's some mythical reader out there who might be attracted to us. I'm just waiting for the flood of MAGA people to start turning into CNN so they can watch Scott Jennings. It's idiotic. It's idiotic. But that's nevertheless what they do. And I think they're flailing. I think they're flailing and failing. And what they're doing makes it worse. And so once they start doing it, they double down and triple down. The other problem is what I call the stories about who gets the center armrest on the airplane. It is the plethora of these stupid self-help lifestyle things for morons. Anyone who needs to figure out who gets the middle armrest on the plane does not need to subscribe to the Washington Post. And yet these publications are now filled with kind of People Magazine dribble. And I apologize to People Magazine because People Magazine is at least about people. It's about something. So they have thrown in all this stuff. Do you know how many games the New York Times has?
Yep.
That's where they make their money, on the games. They charge up the wazoo for the games, for the cooking, for whatever. And so it's all of this gimmickry because they don't have the confidence and the wherewithal to invest in real journalism to attract the audience that does still want and need real journalism. And you're absolutely right when you say we all thought that, hey, Comcast is big enough to take a hit on the news, so they don't have to really cater and kowtow to Donald Trump. Little did we know that, enough is never enough. Enough billions are never enough. Enough regulatory slack is never enough regulatory slack. And there is this craving for access. We call it access journalism. And that's what this is. there's another word for it, and that's pay to play.
Yeah.
That's what giving $1 million to Trump is. That is pay to play. Whether you're paying a politician to listen to you or you're paying a president in order to get to cover you, that's pay to play. That's a corruption of the system. And it's extremely disconcerting. It's extremely disappointing.
I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Washington Post columnist Jen Rubin in a second. But I want to take a moment to let you know that Democracy Docket is committed to be fearlessly independent, unapologetically pro-democracy no matter what. And so if that is important to you, please subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletter. The link is above or in the show notes below. So I want to turn to another topic, which was the other it was the original reason why I wanted to have you on. So I, like a lot of people, I think, really had a hard time processing the whole pardon discussion. Like I just did, like, you know, the Hunter pardon thing, and then like, should Joe Biden pardon? And you wrote something that actually, I read it, and I sent, you know, I think I sent you a note, like I agreed with, but I was kind of like sorting through. And then the other day, I just kind of like had a clarity of moment in my own thinking, which is Donald Trump is going to do whatever Donald Trump is going to do. Like there's no like, if Joe Biden issues blanket pardons, it is not actually going to improve Donald Trump's moral standing. It's not going to affect his conduct. Like, there's a part of this whole debate that, like, I just sort of shook the cobwebs out of my head about and be like, I'm sorry, what am I asking? I'm asking, is Donald Trump going to have an excuse to do something? So that seems kind of dumb. And I think you were one of the first people, honestly, who kind of like staked that moral spot out, that like, what are we talking about? But the second is, and I'm curious your thought, because you really wrote very early on this topic, and took a lot of courage to do that, that you know, if we need people to stand up against Donald Trump and we need people to be strong, then actually these blanket pardons by category, which I think is what you've written about, actually might facilitate that. Like, yes. It's quite the opposite of like, you know, there's a lot of this like, will people accept a pardon? Like, I don't even know what the hell accepting a pardon means. Like, what is, like, I mean, like, what, you think there's going to be like an expiration date and people are going to have to like write in, right? But maybe what it does, these blanket pardons that you have written about and have eloquently talked about, maybe what it actually does is it creates a framework that allows people to be even more courageous in standing up. And in that sense, it would actually be a moral positive. It would be a positive for the movement. But I wanted to, having had that epiphany in my head, I want to road test it with someone who frankly has thought just a lot more about this topic than I have.
I start with the proposition that it is a difficult issue, in particular because you're weighing both unknowns and competing moral principles. On one hand, it is unfair to allow the Supreme Court to, in essence, give Trump a blanket pardon, right, and yet expose the people who did the right thing, who told the truth, who exercised their authority to count election votes, to prosecute cases, to act as jurors, to act as witnesses, to let them twist in the wind. There's something perverse about that. Shouldn't those people be the ones who are getting the protection? The flip side of that is, are we letting Donald Trump, in essence, off the hook in protecting a group of people, protecting him from himself, so he'll be less inclined to do these horrible, dramatic things? And do we further undermine at least part of the public's perception in the innocence of these people, because people will interpret this as, no matter how many times we say it, as some sign that they have done something wrong? And so where I came out was that we should look at the categories of people that are most at risk. And fortunately, they've made lists. They've told us who they think is at risk. And sometimes it's impossible to quantify them enough in order to boil it down to a list or a category that you can extend a pardon to. He's frankly threatened all Democrats, all the media. You can't, the entire
Right.
country theoretically can't be pardoned. But there are certain groups that he is coming after and who have no other protection. And I will say this: I've modified my views somewhat when it comes.
Then I got you at the right time.
Yes, to the extent you have the Liz Cheneys, the members of Congress, they have immunity. They have the speech and debate clause. So if Trump is going to violate that, he's going to violate any kind of pardon that he gets. And many of those people have spoken up and say, no, I dare him to come after me. And I got to say, there would be nothing more enjoyable than Trump and Kash Patel trying to prosecute Liz Cheney. I would pay money to go see that. She is one of the best people to articulate the awfulness, the authoritarianness of Donald Trump, and the spinelessness of Republicans. So sign me up for that one. But there are lots of other people, the quintessential little people, who are really at risk and may suffer grievous harm. And I would raise someone like Cassidy Hutchinson, who was a low-level White House employee who was pressured, as far as we know, by the Trump team to either change her testimony or modify her testimony or not say things that were as damaging, who defied that, came before the January 6th committee, told the truth, and now she is very high on that list of Trump targets. Now, you can say, well, we'll set up a defense fund for her, or we'll do something else to protect her. That's kind of small consolation, as
Right.
you know,
Absolutely.
to people who are the victims of not only the investigation, but the mob that then has their name on their lips and is increasing the threat level, the personal threat level to each of these people. So to identify the people who don't have other protections like speech and debate, or frankly, prosecutors probably have absolute immunity
Right.
for what they do in the courtroom. If you can identify that group of people, I think it is worthwhile to spare them from the heartache, from the personal ordeal that many of them, frankly, have already suffered in part because they have been targeted by the crazies. They do live under threat. They have been sort of dealt a terrible hand for doing the right thing. But there are people who you can spare. And I will say this. I think every president, frankly, is entitled to give a pardon to anybody they want. The plenary power of the pardon probably can't be challenged. But to give a pardon to Hunter Biden and not give it to Cassidy Hutchinson, I have problems with that. I understand that the president thinks that Hunter Biden wouldn't have been prosecuted except for the fact he was his father's son, and that may or may not be true. But he got the benefit of being the president's son and literally got the get out of jail free card. It should not be that someone who did nothing wrong, who committed no crime, who all she did was stand up for democracy like Cassidy Hutchinson, should then have to twist in the wind. Those two things are really problematic. And if I were Joe Biden, thank God I'm not, looking at my legacy, I would not want my legacy to be, I pardoned my son, but I let Cassidy Hutchinson and all the other witnesses have their lives ruined by these terrible people. I really wouldn't. I don't think that's good politics. I don't think it makes moral sense. And so I would suggest he needs to kind of level the playing field for the people who have been unjustly targeted by Donald Trump. If he thinks Hunter Biden's been targeted unjustly, well, I think Cassidy Hutchinson has one better than that.
I just want to clarify one aspect of your thinking on this. Would you do that by naming Cassidy Hutchinson, or would you do it by category? Because I think your piece had really talked more by category, and I'm
Yeah,
curious if
I
you
think you can
revised
do it
that
by
thinking.
category. I think you can say, frankly, anyone who testified in
Right.
opposition to Donald Trump, or anyone who, appeared voluntarily in front of the committee. That would be one way of doing it, because the Trump people generally had to be
Right.
subpoenaed. So that would be one way. You can come up with a distinction. And that way, there may be people who, frankly, don't want the pardon. Bill Barr may not want a pardon, even though he testified against Donald Trump. Fine. He doesn't have to have one. He doesn't have to say, I'm part of the group, leave me alone. But other people will. And I also think by doing it by category, you perhaps minimize the danger that these people are put through,
Right.
because their name is not in the newspapers once again. Because, when Kash Patel came out with his enemies list, and a lot of our colleagues' friends in the media printed that hit list,
Right.
I cringe. Like, what are you doing? You could just describe the list. Is it really necessary to do their work for them? Because part of what they are doing is very fascistic. It's hanging those people out for the mob to attack them and do real damage to them. Really? You got to talk about the names that are on the list when they're not household names, when people may have forgotten about them? Really? That seemed intensely unwise to me. Not prudent, not thoughtful. But I understand that there are people who say, I've done nothing wrong, I don't want a pardon. But that's fine. They can reject the pardon.
That's
They
right.
can say, fine. But for people who really, really need it, I kind of feel like they should get it.
Yeah.
And if he was going to take the position, I don't want anybody who has felt the wrath of Donald Trump to get a fair break. Well, that's a choice. But he sure didn't feel that way when it was his son who was at issue.
Yeah. And so here are the three things that kind of influence my thinking about this. The first is something you mentioned, which is that, I heard a lot of people say, and I was not going to actually use a name, but use Cassidy Hutchinson. So like we can just use her as an example, but it's just an
Right.
example. I heard a lot of people say, well, we can put together a legal defense fund. And honestly, those people have never been involved with federal prosecutions or state prosecutions like that. Like, it is not just the financial cost of lawyers. It is the psychic cost. It is the reputational cost. It is the fear of the unknown of what can be a very difficult and long drawn out process that can yield a very unpredictable and oftentimes unjust result. So that kind of like, I thought, okay, well, I think that the people on the other side of this are not really thinking this through the way I do. The second is something that actually ties back to something we talked about earlier about the media, which is, I look at the way in which the media covers Donald Trump and the way in which it covers democracy issues. And I think if Cassidy Hutchinson got indicted, it wouldn't be that the headlines would say Donald Trump engages in political prosecution of enemy. It would instead be an article that would say former Trump aide indicted. And then it would say, federal prosecutors today criminally charged Cassidy Hutchinson with the following things. And then it would recite from the indictment the thing. And sure, down in the 8th paragraph or 9th paragraph, it might say, and critics of Donald Trump say that this is right. So like, it's not just that the people would be tarred by the right wing lunatics who, are out to them. But honestly, I don't have any, I looked at the coverage. This is part of what was the break for me. I looked at the coverage of the defamation lawsuit against Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register. And a lot of the mainstream media coverage is just like treats this like it's just like a lawsuit, and I'm thinking, poor, Ann Seltzer is like getting dragged through a lot here.
Right.
And so that influenced my thinking of the pardon. So tell me, am I off base to think of
No,
it that way?
that is exactly right. They will play it, they will pretend it's, as you say, just an investigation, because they have no moral compass that is able to detect, okay, this is what dictators do. They try to lock up their enemies on trumped up charges. no pun intended, as opposed to Jack Smith did a real investigation, found real evidence of a crime, and all of these bullshit excuses that Trump came up with, no matter what the Supreme Court says, doesn't make his guilt any less obvious. They are incapable of making that distinction because they have got it in their head that somehow their rule is to be morally neutral. How you can be morally neutral in that circumstance is a great illustration of why you wind up being a tool of disinformation. By not pointing these things out, you are telling the public something fundamentally untrue, which is a prosecution of Cassidy Hutchinson would be no different than a prosecution of Donald Trump. And that's abhorrent. And by the way, it is remarkable that when Donald Trump has sued a pollster for putting out a poll, I don't think like that has ever been done in the history of frivolous litigation. And any judge who does not throw that out immediately and sanction the lawyers for frivolous lawsuits should himself or herself be taken to the woodshed. If that isn't an outrage and a sheer act of intimidation, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
And
No.
And of course, it makes logical no sense. He suffered no damage from it. It has margins of error. He's a public, on and on and on. You can come up with all the legal defenses, but the fundamental essence of that is this isn't a lawsuit. It's a thug trying to intimidate the free press, and we shouldn't put up with it. We shouldn't dignify it by analyzing it as a legitimate lawsuit. And because the press is incapable of doing it, you're right. The outrage, the injury is twice. Once that Donald Trump has come after you, and second, like the press treats it as if, hey, you're being investigated.
Yeah. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what is going badly. One of the big questions I get, and I'm sure if I get it, you get it 10 times as much because you write a hugely popular column. And it is, by the way, for everyone who has asked me about unsubscribing from the Post, I always tell them I will continue to subscribe to the Washington Post for as long as Jen Rubin writes there because it is worth the price. It is worth the price of just her. So I don't read much in the Washington Post, but I read everything Jen writes,
and that's enough. I'll take it.
And that's good, and that's kind of my position on that. But I'm sure you get a lot of people who want to know, like, all right, so what is it that we should be doing? Like, what is the not what the politicians should be doing. I mean, you could offer prescriptions there too, but like, what is it that for your readers you say to them, like, okay, what do I do?
Right. The first thing they do is should subscribe to a local newspaper, okay, where there has been a absolute sort of decimation of the field. It is incredibly important because those are the people who cover state capitals, who cover corruption at a low level, who have a lot of credibility because they're in the community and they are dying. So go get yourself a subscription to a local newspaper. Support nonprofit media, ProPublica, State's Newsroom. There are a whole bunch of them, and I write about some of them because those people really are the ones who have no bias. And wouldn't you know, they're the ones who turn up the real dirt. ProPublica is the one who broke the Clarence Thomas story. ProPublica is the one that reported on the real taxes that billionaires are paying or not paying. Isn't that strange how once you get into the realm of nonprofit and non-self-interest, you get an amazing amount of information that you would not otherwise get. So that would be number one. Support people who are actually doing the good journalism. The second thing is, if you're not a lawyer, if you are not going to run for office, at least support by volunteer and by dollars those people who are fighting the good fight, whether it's Democracy Docket, whether it's Protect Democracy, whether it's the ACLU. Pick one or more groups that are doing the hard work of democracy and support them, because those people day in and day out are going to be the ones like you who file the lawsuits, who make the arguments, who force occasionally the mainstream media to cover something accurately. And they are, in some instances, the first and final line of defense for the rest of us. So that would be the next thing. What I would say beyond that is there are a stratum of politicians, Democrats who need a little push to do the right thing, a little bit more spine, Republicans who are kind of vulnerable, like they might, be in danger in the next election. I'm looking at you, Susan Collins. I'm looking at you, Tom Tillis, who, if they hear from constituents, and I really mean their constituents, because politicians generally don't care about other people, that they will at least think twice or three times. That if Susan Collins is met with protesters outside her office, peacefully protesting, I would add, that over her going along with the latest Trump tax bill or the latest tariff or whatever heck she's going to rationalize, she will think twice and three times. And if she does it anyway, then you will have all the more reason to support a challenger come 2026 if she's going to be on the ballot. So keep an eye out for those people who you can make an impact on. Politicians do go to town meetings. They do appear on talk radio. They do take questions now and then. They do track their mail, how many for, how many against. So it's not fruitless. I get a lot of people who say, well, my two senators are Marco Rubio and Rick Scott. And what I say to them is, I'm sorry. And then I say, well, who's your congressperson? Who's your city council? Who's like your assembly person? Sometimes there really is no one who is going to listen. And then all you can do is peacefully exercise your First Amendment rights. 26, I believe it is, states have either an initiative or a referendum. Use those mechanisms with your fellow members of your state to advance things. 7 of the 10 measures protecting reproductive freedom passed in the same election that Donald Trump was just elected in. We have gotten, as you know, redistricting, neutral districting, changes in voting laws only because there is an initiative and referendum process in certain states. So use that, figure out what those are, organize, support them. And the last thing I will say is many states, most states, have elected judges. Right. Those elections are so important. The Wisconsin miracle, to the extent to which they have survived this red wave and have a Democratic governor, have fought back a 19th century abortion ban, have redistricted so they actually had a representative sample of Democrats represented in the assembly and state, began because they organized on the election of a swing state on their Supreme Court. That makes all the difference in the world. So as tempting as it is to let your eyes glaze over, or not even to vote for judges because you say, I'm not a lawyer, what do I know? Right. Figure out who they are and what they stand for. That makes a huge difference. And as the federal courts get more and more polluted with Trump appointees, as you know, the state courts become all that more important. And at least in many states, you have the right to either elect them or not confirm them if a legislative committee has put them out, that you have some power there and use it. Now, all of that adding up together does not protect us from the likes of Donald Trump. We are talking about making things a little better where we can, and more importantly, not undermining the effort to get back into power in 2026 and 2028. So the other thing people can do is save up their kitty so they can make donations in 2026 to good Democrats who are going to win in those places, and get ready for the long fight. And I will say, really good Democrats know how to win elections, and they win elections. And you look at Tammy Baldwin, you look at Rubin Gallejo, you look at some of the congressmen who did knock out Republicans. There are good Democrats who know how to fight and who can win, and you got to support them, because right now there's only one party that is pro little d Democrat and has any concern for your family's future or your own future. So that's kind of what I tell readers. Doesn't always satisfy them. They say, yeah, but how do I get rid of Donald Trump? And the answer is you get everybody you know to vote against Republicans.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. You know, I wrote a piece on Democracy Docket about building a new opposition, and the first thing I said is we need to win elections. Yeah. Like it is easy to say let's build a movement and all of that, but like fundamentally, you know, the problem is that right now Republicans have political power, and they will abuse it, they will misuse it, they will use it to attack democracy, they'll use it to attack their political opponents, but they'll also use it to enact policies that are antithetical to the interests of the country. And so if you want to stop that, like first and foremost means electing Democrats. And, you know, we need to be a big enough tent to allow Democrats who can win one place to campaign differently than Democrats who could win another place. And I know you agree with that.
Yes. In fact, I have a piece coming up on Sunday that's kind of the last line of it, which is, if you want to stop all this bad stuff, you got to stop losing elections.
Yeah.
And there's no substitute for winning.
Everyone, make sure you read that piece. Make sure you follow Jen Rubin on all social media. She also has a phenomenal podcast, and we'll put a link to that as well. And so I hope everyone takes a look at that. Jen Rubin, I posted on Blue Sky earlier that you are a hero, which is true. You are. And so I want to thank you for everything you do for the country, and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Mark. Coming from you, that is high praise. There is no one, and I mean no one, who has done more in the courts and the legislatures to protect democracy and to foil the dastardly plans of the Republican Party than you. And you're so good at it that they hold you up in, you know, fury. Why don't we have Marc Elias? And that's because really smart people tend to be Democrats. But besides that, you have done yeoman's work, and everyone who is watching and everyone who reads Democracy Docket should know the intellectual heft and effort that goes into dozens and dozens and dozens of lawsuits. So thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Defending Democracy. Make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time.